As we take a look at the second half of this chapter, we're going to now move into the Senate. And as you notice on the screen here, we have a picture of the President Pro Temp. At least at this point, his name is Orrin Hatch. And you should mark him down and keep note of him, at least for right now. The President Pro Tempore, his main role and job is to oversee the business of the Senate. Now, the Vice President is the head of the Senate, and that is one of his main roles and objectives. However, the Vice President has many other duties and responsibilities that will take him away from overseeing business that happens in the Senate. And so the President Pro Temp is somebody who steps in place of the Vice President when the Vice President is gone and oversees all of the things that are happening in the Senate. Very similar to the role of the Speaker of the House, except this is in the Senate. And so anytime that the Vice President is in session, then the President Pro Temp will take a back seat and allow the Vice President to preside over events that are going on in the Senate. Now, typically the Vice President doesn't do a whole lot in this role. Many times he just shows up for important bills that are being voted on, or if there was ever a tie in the Senate, then the Vice President will step in. Otherwise, the President Pro Temp really helps to run the Senate chamber. Now let's talk a little bit about the Senate itself. The Senate has 2 members for every state. I know we've talked about that in previous chapters, and there have been a number of things that's come up. It's considered the upper house for between the Senate and the House of Representatives. This one typically is viewed as the higher ranking office. Almost 1/3 of the senators that we currently have at one time were once representatives. However, nobody goes from being a senator to then becoming a representative. It doesn't usually work that way. Most aspire to climb to the office of the Senate instead. When we look at the senators, most of them find themselves to be more nationally recognized and nationally known, and so it typically becomes a stepping stone to a higher office if they desire, or perhaps even a lifelong career. Those who are elected were originally elected to their position by the state legislators. They would choose the 2 people that they wanted to represent their state, and the people had no say. Of course, we know, because we've studied the amendments, that the 17th Amendment changed this to where the people now directly elect their senators. Now, the senators do represent the entire state as a whole. They do not represent specific regions like we saw with the House of Representatives. So that means for the entire state of Indiana or Illinois or Ohio or wherever you may be, they are going to represent the entire group of people together. So those 2 representatives, those 2 senators, have a lot of people they are trying to reach out toward. If there were a vacancy, the 17th Amendment also covers this for senators. The governor has the opportunity to either appoint a new senator without the consent of the people or without the people voting on a new senator, or they can have a special election that will also be determined by the governor. He will set the time and the place for that, but that way the people get a say in who the new senator is. And I think each state will take that on a case-by-case basis. It may depend on the length of the term that's remaining in that senator's position as well. So the 17th Amendment plays a key part in that, and it's also important to note that the term for the senators is much longer than those of the representatives. For senators, it is 6 years, and we have a rotation in which only 1/3 of the entire body of the Senate will be up for election at a time. And they've also structured this in a way that no state is going to have both of their senators up for election in the same year. That way, they can continue on with business while the other is campaigning and working on re-election. If you are to run for Senate, there are a few qualifications that you have to meet. First of all, you've got to be at least 30 years old. So that is a 5-year increase from what we saw in the House of Representatives. You also have to be a citizen of the United States for 9 years. Once again, it's not a requirement that you're a natural-born citizen here to fill in the Senate, but you must be at least a 9-year citizen. And then you also need to live in the state in which you are trying to represent. I think that makes pretty clear and obvious sense for that. Now, it is possible for the Senate to expel a member. You do have to get approval for each one of the newly elected senators. However, it is rare that they will not approve a senator that's been elected by their state. But if a senator is performing poorly or has some misconduct, it requires a 2/3 vote of the members of the Senate to expel somebody out of that body. Up to this date, there have been, I believe it's 15 that have been expelled in our Senate's history. Most of the time, they will opt for a penalty or instead of expelling them, they may put a punishment or disorderly conduct on that senator as a warning, and most of the time they fall in line pretty quickly. Now, last section here, at least I think this is our last section, is the congressional members and the roles and the things that they play. We're going to take a look at some of those roles here. And for each of these members of Congress, of course, there are 535 total members of Congress, and they play 5 major roles that we're going to take a look at here. But before we get into those 5 roles, I think it's important to look at the demographics and the people who serve here in both the Senate and the House. Most members claim some form of religion in the United States, and so that can vary, obviously, based off of their background, but majority belong to a Protestant form of religion, and then the second most would be a Catholic background. There's a very small minority of other different religious views, but most people will align themselves with some sort of religious group. The average member of Congress is a white male in his 50s. However, that is changing a little bit to where we've had a lot more females get elected into Congress in recent years. Almost all congressmen and women have gone to college, and most of them have advanced degrees. There are quite a few lawyers that are involved in politics here, and most of these are either middle class or upper class, tend to be fairly wealthy. There are not a whole lot who would be considered below that middle class level, if any, that I know of. Now, let's look at those 5 major roles that I talked about. Their first role is first and foremost to be legislators, to make the laws. They are supposed to represent their constituents in order to make laws that are going to benefit the entire country. The second role is that of a representative. Now, I'm not specifically speaking of the House of Representatives here. I am speaking more in general as members of Congress, so we're talking about Senate and representatives, that they are to represent those that have put them into office. And there's really 4 different ways that they can execute this representation. The first way is that of a trustee. Those that choose to take this route tend to vote on things based off of their own conscience and their own judgment, and they'll take every individual situation, every individual vote based off of the scenario that they see before them and based off of their own values. They do not usually attempt to follow the majority opinion of their constituents. So it's very much how I, as a representative of the people, believe that this is going to be in the best interest of the United States moving forward. The second form of representation is that of a delegate. This is where you are going to align yourself with the majority people that have elected you, and you are going to vote almost entirely with the majority opinion of those that you represent, even if it goes against your own personal beliefs and opinions. And so you are going to pay very close attention to what your voters want in that role as a delegate. Those that follow the partisan viewpoint are going to vote with their political party almost exclusively. And most of the time, they will look to see what the party leaders, the party bosses, want to see happen, and they're going to follow through on that and vote straight party lines. And then the last one are those that are labeled as politicos. These are the ones that attempt to balance all 3 roles. It's a very difficult job to do because you're never going to make any group happy by trying to take little bits and pieces from all three, but there are some that do try to do that. And I'll let you evaluate on your own what you think is the best route for each of our representatives. And if you were to be in Congress, what you think would be the best approach. The third role that they play is that of a committee member. There are a lot of different committees that are formed, and those that are part of these committee members, they deliberate on bills before they go to the House or the Senate floor, and they will often create a summary of those bills so that way other senators or representatives that have not been in those committee discussions can see some of the highlights of things that have gone on. And many times the compromises and the major decisions are made in committees before they ever reach the floor. Now, these committees also provide a way to keep a check on the presidency. Some of these committees, they're responsible for overseeing everything that is going on in the executive branch, and they will bring to the attention the wrongdoings or the misguidings or anything that needs to be confronted in the executive office. They'll bring that to the attention of other senators or representatives. The fourth role is that of a servant to the constituent. This is perhaps more of a minor role, but maybe a way that you could take advantage of the services they offer. They will often meet with those that they represent when they come to Washington. So anytime you go to Washington, D.C., it's always a good idea to reach out to your senator or representative, and they can schedule a meeting for you. They can provide, help you get tickets into the White House or into the Capitol building, provide tours and that type of thing for you, or even just to listen to any concerns that you have. They are your servant. And then they also serve the role as politicians. They do have an election to gear up for and hopefully to win. And so they do have to serve that role. Some fill that role much more diligently than others, and they spend more time on that than others, while some put that as their last role, looking at these other four roles prior to this as much more important, and therefore this one, if they don't get elected, well, they don't get elected, and they will let somebody else take that role. As we look at compensation for these members of Congress, Congress gets to set their own salary thanks to the 27th Amendment. This has its pros and cons. Of course, as they set their own salary, there's a lot of criticism for that because they are in control of the budget. But at the same time, I think it's also important that we note that they can adjust their salary, but it cannot take into effect until the next election cycle. And so even if you vote in favor of it, you've got to win another election before any of those things can take place. Every year, there is a cost of living increase that is built into their salary. And so that is supposed to account for inflation, and that way it will also help them to be able to counteract any of the increase in travel expenses or increase in housing expenses that go on each and every year. They do have the option to decline that if they so choose. There are lots of non-salary benefits. I've only listed a small portion of the package that they have, and so please understand that there are many more that they have in their compensation package. Again, this could be an area of criticism for some of our politicians. If they are truly to be servants of the people, why do they need to be pampered in such a way? You decide. But they do have a lot of things that take them away from their families, and so they should be compensated for that, and they should be compensated for their time and travel. But I'll give you a few of the things in here. They get a lot of what is labeled as fringe benefits that are put in here. Everybody gets special tax deductions to help them because of the fact that they have two different residencies, one in Washington, D.C. and one also back home in whatever state they're coming from. And so they get a major tax deduction for that. They also get generous travel allowances to help them to be able to go back and forth between their home and between Washington, D.C. There have been a few senators that have bragged about the low amount of travel expenses that they have incurred and the fact that they don't take advantage of this or they don't cash in their receipts and that type of thing. Well, generally, those are the senators that come from states that are very close to Washington, D.C., states like Maryland or Virginia or New Jersey that it's not a very far commute for them, and so it doesn't quite seem as generous as they are making it out to be. They also get insurance and medical care. Once again, this is something that was rarely brought up when the Obamacare Act was being pushed through. Those that were writing this and those that were passing it and arguing over it were not going to be affected by the Obamacare at all. So those that are part of Congress, they get insurance and medical care for life, and there is a generous pension package that goes along with this, and they get very low-cost insurance. They pay very small amount for any of their insurance benefits that they get, and they get access to very, very good medical care as well. That is part of their pension plan, their retirement as well. They get that medical care for them and their families throughout the remainder of their lifetime. And again, that would be a criticism for those that passed the Obamacare. They were not really doing anything that was going to affect them, that was going to affect the American people. They also have a office package that helps them with daily office expenses. They get something called franking privilege. This is the ability to be able to send letters and to send mail packages, those type of things, without any cost. They also get special radio and TV discounts in order to be able to put out their program and agenda and even be able to get recognized leading up to the next election. These are part of the reasons, especially letters E, F, and G on this list, why incumbent members of Congress are so hard to defeat when they are up for election, because they have access to all these other things that the challenger does not have. And so that's where some have questioned, should we have limitations? Should we have certain things that they need to cut off the members of Congress? And while there are budgetary limitations, some of these non-salary benefits can seemingly go on for page after page. But most of these limitations are not enforced unless Congress were to write in a bill that would specifically limit some of their compensation, or if the president were to veto certain items off this compensation package. The other limitation that Congress may have, it's not really written in stone or written anywhere, but is that of voter backlash. As voters see certain members of Congress getting these benefits and yet not doing something for the American people, that can put a black eye on the members of Congress. So while I've perhaps been a little bit negative about the amount of salary benefits that they get and the compensation that they get, there are a number that do decline some of these options just so that way they don't seem like they're taking too much advantage. And so each member of Congress kind of does his own thing with those things, but they are available or have been used in the past. They do get a couple other privileges as well that I need to mention. They have a no arrest privilege anytime that they are on their way to or from the Capitol or taking care of government business. And so this is usually enforced or usually taken advantage during their travel, so they can ignore the speed limit, they can run through intersections, of course, hopefully safely, in order to be able to get to Congress quickly and to be able to take care of government business. And so they're immune from arrest for that. Now, there is an exception there. If it's a criminal case or criminal situation, then that does not apply. They also have an extension of freedom of speech that carries on to the Senate or the House floor. And so they are immune here from any sort of prosecution for anything that they say on the floor of the House or the Senate. That means that potentially they could go out there and they could start theoretically committing libel. They could be slandering somebody. They could reveal classified information. They could say just about anything that they want to because of this protection. Because the framers of the Constitution wanted to make sure that members of Congress had the freedom to say anything and keep the freedom of speech protected within the debate, and that way everybody could freely speak their mind without fear of any sort of backlash or consequence.